Hello, in this screencast I'm going to show you how to write a function in JavaScript so that we can reuse code. I'll start by showing you a bad way of doing things where we do repeat ourselves. Remember, our work we should try and write code that is dry, is the acronym DRY, don't repeat yourself, as opposed to wet, write everything twice. So what we'll end up with is this idea. I've got here a series of sections. When I mouse over them, I'll attach a style to them to change the styling of various things, adding a border and changing the text, and when I mouse out it'll go back again. So that's where we're headed to. Okay, so let's think of a bad way of doing this. So first of all, let's make a script. We're going to window on load. Now I write this so many times I've written a small thingy bob that does it automatically for me. So window, it adds an event listener to load, it calls a function, and rather than making an anonymous function, I've just called it initialize because it's a bit easier to debug. So let's imagine I wanted to do an event listener on that, an event listener on that, an event listener on that. Well, a bad way of doing it would be that I might say var s1 equals document get element by ID, and it's what was the element b1, and having got that, I've then got that into s1, so then I might say s1 on mouse over equals function, and it could be an anonymous function, but I'm not going to make an anonymous function. I'm going to give it a name called s1 on mouse over. And what's that going to do? Well, we're going to want to say this if it's got a class list. So let's say if it's got a class list, then let's toggle. So let's try that. Oh, yeah, it brings in that style. So I want to mouse out as well, mouseleave or whatever it is. S1 on mouse function. Okay, so that works okay, doesn't it? Okay, so basically let's just go through this. I've got hold of the element using get element by ID, and then I've attached an on mouse over, and I've got a feeling, I'd slightly prefer on mouse enter, and I can't remember why I prefer that. It's one of those things that sometimes you learn about what the difference is between mouse enter and mouse over and mouse leave and mouse out, and you think, oh, it's better if I use mouse enter, and then you forget why. So there we go. Then I touch on mouse enter, that what it does is it uses that particular, it toggles that particular class. Okay. So if I want to do the same thing with B2, then what I'm going to have to do is kind of repeat all of that, aren't I? I'm going to take all of that, I'm just pressing Control D to duplicate it, and instead of S1, get element B2, so reload, and it works on that one, and it works on that one. But I've repeated myself. So what is it? The acronym's dry, don't repeat yourself, and wet, write everything twice. So here, look, I've got S1, and here I've got S2, and S1 on mouse enter. Well, that's daft, is it? It would be better to write functions that do this. So let's examine what the differences are between those two bits of code, that bit of code there, and the bit of code underneath that's not highlighted. Well, the only difference is the ID of the thing I want to change, and the thing that I'm actually toggling it to, the class that I'm toggling it to. Because don't forget, I could actually probably write a different class. So let's start all over again and write a function instead that does those kinds of things instead of repeating myself. So I'm going to write a function change style. So if I'm going to change the style, then I'm going to want some sort of ID, and I'm going to want some sort of color, or actually not some sort of color, some sort of style to change to, aren't I? So those are the two things that varied: an ID according to what I'm trying to, the ID of the thing I'm trying to alter, and then the style that I'm going to attach. So inside this function, I'm going to make up a variable called element, and what element is going to be, it's going to equal document get element by ID, using the ID that was passed in. That's a variable that will equal something, and we can see that in a moment when I use the debugger. And then what we're going to do is say element dot class list toggle, and whatever that style was that I passed in. Okay, so I've written a nice simple little function, and now what I can do is I could add that function as a listener to each of these things. Well, rather than add them individually, it would be better, or a different way of doing it is that I grab all of these things and then loop through them and attach the appropriate listeners. An even better way actually would be to add a listener to the parent, but that involves a technique called delegation, which I'll cover in a later screencast. So for the time being then, let's just add individual listeners. So I'm going to make up a variable called elements, and that equals document dot query selector all, and I want to find all of the sections. So that's my selector. It's like a CSS selector. It'll find all of these sections, whatever they are. I think what I'm going to do now is loop through them. So for var n equals 0, n is less than elements dot length. And by the way, it's not a good thing to be doing this inside the loop. It would be better to make a separate variable that holds elements length, rather than recalculate it every single time around the loop. Actually, I've just said that, and that probably makes no bleeding sense to you at all, so let me explain what that is. So n elements equals elements dot length, and now instead of putting that inside here, because don't forget, the number of elements isn't going to change, whereas each time around that loop, if I put elements length, it has to look it up and calculate it, whereas I don't need to do that. So what I've done instead is create a variable that does that. And notice that my nice editor has just gone grey, indicating that I've made a variable that's not used, and that's because I misspelled it there, like it should be elements length. Okay, so I've done that. So now what I need to do is I can say elements n, that gives me that current element that I'm dealing with, and let's attach an on mouse enter equals an anonymous function, and that anonymous function will be to call change style, passing in this thing's ID and the style I want to change it to, highlight. And let's do exactly the same thing for on mouseleave as well. So I'm just highlighting that, press, well in my case, Command D because I'm on a Mac. So on mouseleave, and that what D duplicates, it saves me typing it all out again. Let's just see if what I've done works. So let's go into the source view. Let's have a look at the code we've written. Let's click in the margin and set a breakpoint, and let's click there and set a breakpoint, and then I'll reload the page, and in it comes, and it gets all the sections and stores them into elements. And here I can see elements is a node list with 3 things in it. Look, and as I highlight over them, it shows me what those 3 things are. Then it's going to work out how many elements there are. So n element equals 3. and then for n equals 0, whilst n is less than the number of elements, it'll go into this loop. And now for elements n, and n is 0, so in other words, it'll get that one, it'll add an onMouseenter to equal this function. Okay, so when this function gets called, it'll do that code there. And when I leave, it'll do that code there. So it'll apply that, and then it'll go on to the next n, which is then 1, and it'll do the same again. So let's see what happens. Mouse over, and so what it's doing, look, is calling a change style with this thing's ID, which is b1. So let's step into that function, and we'll see, go into there, and now remember I passed in b1, so ID now has the value b1, so it will get the element called b1, store it into element, which is that section, and then it'll toggle whatever that style is. Okay, so it adds that. Now, unfortunately, because to use the debugger I had to mouse out, so it won't quite work, but believe me, when a mouse in and mouse out, now it's going to call change style, and ID is b1, toggles that, and the element disappears. So suddenly what I've done is I've created a function to do something. What about if I forget to pass this in? In other words, what about if this variable here, style, has no value? Maybe we could give it a default value. So how about if I say style equals whatever the style is, but if it doesn't equal anything, then it equals highlight. Let me talk you through that, because you'll see this construct quite a lot in JavaScript. Basically it means that equals whatever that equals, but if that doesn't equal anything, then this is an OR. So what it'll have to do is one side or other of this OR has to be true. So if that's false, it will use that. It's known as a guard operator or a default operator. So let's see how that works. Here, look, I've not passed a second parameter, so let's reload the page, and let's see, called change style when nothing's assigned to it. So do that, go over. Now it's going to call change style, but it's only passing in one thing, the ID. So in it comes, so style, look, is undefined. It says there, style undefined. So on it goes. Now, if I left it as undefined, it'll try and toggle to undefined. So style equals style, well, that's not the case because that's undefined. So it will go to the other side of the OR, and when I move on one line, you'll see style here suddenly will become equal to highlight. So it will toggle the class of highlight. Okay. So we've made our code a little bit more robust. So that's our simple function that that we can reuse. If we're going to reuse it, actually, it makes no sense that it's in here. It would be better if that function were in a separate file. So let's quickly do that. Right mouse click, new JavaScript file. I'm going to call it my functions, and inside my functions I'm going to take that code that defined what the function was, cut it out altogether. Inside my functions I'm going to paste that in. So I've got a function called change style, and you end up with quite a lot of functions over time that you can find useful and reuse them. So I've got to in some way now load that file. So the easiest way to do it is here. I'll write script source equals that. Okay, so what that will do is access that file, and that function will be available. Let's just see that work. So I'll reload this page. Here I'm calling change style, so I'll put a breakpoint there where I call change style, and let's see what happens. Take off these breakpoints, run on, so scroll over, it'll call change style. So let's go into that, and notice what it's done. Look, it's called change style inside my functions, because we loaded my functions here in this line here. Okay, over and out.